It began with two friends who loved electronics more than they loved sleep, more than they loved money, more than almost anything else in their lives. This is the story of Apple. Texto predeterminado. Tits 1976. Steve Jobs is 21 years old. He's dropped out of college, spent time at an Oregon commune, traveled to India searching for enlightenment, and worked odd jobs at Atari fixing video games at night so he could avoid the day shift. X2. Predeterminado. His friend Steve Wozniak is the opposite. Quiet, brilliant, an engineer's engineer. The kind of person who designs circuit boards for fun and gives away his best ideas for free at the local computer bias club because he simply loves showing people what he's built. Wozniak has designed something remarkable, a fully assembled circuit board that can be hooked up to a keyboard and a television and actually function as a computer. At the time, that idea alone is revolutionary. Most computers in 1976 are the size of refrigerators, cost tens of thousands of dollars, and belong to universities or corporations. Never to ordinary people. Jobs sees Wozniak's board and understands something his friend doesn't fully grasp yet. This isn't just a hobbyist's project. This could be a product, something people could buy. So Jobs pushes. He convinces Wozniak that instead of just giving the design away to their friends at the club, they should build these boards and sell them. To pull it off, Jobs sells his Volkswagen van. Wozniak sells his prized scientific calculator. Together, they scrape together around $1,300. On April 1, 1976, they officially go into business. They set up shop in the Jobs family garage in Los Altos. Jobs' sister builds circuit boards alongside them. His mother fields business calls. There is no office, no staff, no safety net, just a workbench, a soldering iron, and an idea neither of them can quite let go of. Their first product, later known as the Apple I, sells for $666.50, a price Wozniak picked simply because he liked repeating digits. With no idea it would one day cause controversy for entirely different reasons. It's a strange, fragile beginning. No one in that garage in 1976 could have imagined that the company they were about to name after a fruit on a whim, because Jobs liked the word and had recently visited an apple orchard, would one day be worth more than the economies of most countries on Earth. But first, they had to survive their first year. The Apple I proved they could build a computer. It didn't prove they could build a company. That changed when a man named Mike Markkula walked into their lives. Markkula was in his early 30s, already retired from a fortune he'd made at Intel, and looking for something new to invest his time in. When he saw what Jobs and Wozniak were building, he didn't just see clever engineering, he saw the beginning of an entire industry. Markkula invested around $250,000 of his own money and, just as importantly, brought something the two young founders didn't have: business credibility. Banks and suppliers were far more willing to work with a company that had an experienced operator standing behind it. With Markkula's backing, Wozniak set to work on a successor to the Apple I, something far more ambitious. The result was the Apple II, unveiled in 1977. Unlike its predecessor, the Apple II came in a real plastic case, supported color graphics, and was designed to be usable by someone who had never touched a computer in their life. It wasn't a kit for hobbyists anymore. It was a finished product for regular people. The timing was extraordinary. A new category called the personal computer was just beginning to take shape, and the Apple II became one of the machines that defined it. Small businesses started using it for bookkeeping. Schools began buying it for classrooms. Families brought it into their living rooms. Sales climbed year after year, and in December 1980, Apple went public. The stock offering was one of the most successful in Wall Street history to that point, practically overnight. Steve Jobs, 25 years old, was worth over $200 million, several early employees became millionaires before their 30th birthdays. Even Apple's landlord and its earliest financial supporters saw life-changing returns. For a company that had existed for barely 4 years, that had started with a sold-off and a second-hand calculator, it was a staggering transformation. Apple was no longer a garage project. It was one of the fastest-growing companies in America. Steve Jobs was becoming a public figure, the young, sharp-eyed face of an industry that was just beginning to reshape the world. But success brought a new set of problems. Bigger company, bigger ambitions, and a leader whose instincts didn't always align with the people now running the business. Alongside him, by the early 1980s, Apple needed something more than a bigger version of the Apple II. It needed its next big idea, and Jobs became obsessed with delivering it. That obsession centered on a project called the Macintosh. Unlike anything Apple had built before, the Macintosh was designed around a graphical interface, icons, windows, and a mouse instead of the text commands that dominated computing at the time. Jobs had seen early versions of this kind of interface on a visit to Xerox's research labs, and he became convinced it was the future of how humans would interact with computers. Jobs didn't just want the Macintosh to work. He wanted it to be perfect. He pushed the engineering team relentlessly, rejecting designs that didn't meet his standard, obsessing over details as small as the shape of the internal circuit board, something almost no user would ever see. His team worked brutal hours under a leader known for being inspiring one moment and devastating the next at the same time. Apple's board felt the company needed more experienced management to keep growing. In 1983, they recruited John Sculley, then the president of Pepsi-Cola, to become Apple's CEO. Jobs personally courted him with a now famous pitch, challenging him to choose between selling sugar water for the rest of his life or joining Apple to help change the world. Sculley said yes. In January 1984, Apple launched the Macintosh with a landmark television commercial that aired during the Super Bowl, portraying the computer as a tool of liberation against a gray, conformist world. It was a sensation. Sales were strong out of the gate, and for a moment, it looked like Jobs' vision had been vindicated. But underneath the excitement, tension was building. Jobs ran the Macintosh division almost like his own separate company, often clashing with the teams behind Apple's other product lines. His relationship with Sculley, once warm, began to fracture as sales cooled and the two men disagreed sharply over strategy and control. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic falls in business history, and it was about to happen to the man who had built the company from a garage. By 1985, the Macintosh's early sales momentum had slowed, and the tension between Jobs and Sculley had turned into open conflict. Jobs wanted more control. Sculley, backed by Apple's board, wanted stability and believed Jobs' management style was becoming a liability. Jobs attempted to regain power directly, according to accounts from people close to the situation. He tried to organize an internal move to push Sculley out and reclaim control of the company himself. The attempt failed when the board was forced to choose between its CEO and its co-founder. They sided with Sculley. Jobs was stripped of his operational responsibilities. He kept his title as chairman, but it was symbolic. He had no real authority left inside the company he had started in his parents' garage less tea. A decade earlier, that September, Jobs formally resigned from Apple altogether. It was, by nearly every account, one of the most painful moments of his life. He had built this company from nothing, poured his identity into it, and now he was walking away from it as an outsider. But Jobs didn't disappear. Almost immediately, he founded a new company called NeXT, focused on building powerful computers for higher education and business. The machines were technologically impressive but expensive, and NeXT struggled commercially for years without ever becoming the kind of mass-market success Apple had been. Around the same time, Jobs made another move that seemed unrelated at the time but would prove enormously significant. In 1986, he purchased the computer graphics division of Lucasfilm for $10 million. He spun it off into its own company, Pixar. 4 years, Pixar operated at a loss, and Jobs personally funded it out of his own pocket to keep it alive. No one, least of all Jobs himself, could have predicted how these two ventures would eventually intertwine with his future. For now, he was simply an outsider, building things far from the company that bore the mark of his early genius. While back at Apple, the business he'd left behind was heading toward its own crisis. During the decade after Jobs left, Apple remained profitable, but it slowly lost the sense of direction that had once defined it. The company released a growing number of computers with confusing names and overlapping purposes. Product lines multiplied, innovation slowed, competitors, especially Microsoft, expanded rapidly across the personal computer market. Windows became the dominant operating system around the world, while Apple's market share steadily declined. Inside the company, leadership changed repeatedly. CEOs came and went, each promising a turnaround, but none managed to restore Apple's momentum. The company that had once defined the future now seemed to be chasing it. By the mid-1990s, Apple was losing money at an alarming rate. Analysts openly questioned whether the company could survive. Cash reserves were shrinking. Projects were canceled. Employees feared that bankruptcy was becoming a real possibility. few people believed Apple would still exist by the end of the decade. Ironically, the technology Apple now needed most was being developed by the man it had forced out. Next operating system had matured into one of the most advanced software platforms in the industry, offering capabilities that Apple's aging system could no longer match. In late 1996, Apple made a decision that would change its history forever. The company agreed to purchase Next for more than $400 million. The acquisition wasn't just about software. It brought Steve Jobs back to Apple. At first, Jobs returned only as an advisor. Few expected that the co-founder, who had once been pushed aside, would soon take control again. But as Apple's financial situation continued to deteriorate, it became increasingly clear that the company needed more than advice. It needed leadership. The man who had walked away more than a decade earlier was about to receive a second chance, and this time, he intended to rebuild Apple from the ground up. Jobs didn't return to Apple demanding his old job back. At first, he simply advised, quietly assessing a company that was, by his own private judgment, in far worse shape than even the public numbers suggested. What he found troubled him deeply. A bloated product lineup with dozens of overlapping models. A culture that had lost its sense of direction. A brand that, in his eyes, had drifted far from the identity that once made it special. Within months, the board pushed out the sitting CEO, and Jobs stepped in as interim leader, a role that would soon become permanent in everything but title. He acted fast and, at times, ruthlessly. He slashed Apple's product lineup down to a fraction of its former size, canceling projects that didn't fit a clear vision. He negotiated a deal with Apple's longtime rival, Microsoft, which agreed to invest in Apple and continue developing its Office software for Macintosh computers. A move that shocked the industry and signaled that Apple wasn't simply going to disappear. Just as important as any single business decision was a shift in identity. Apple launched a new advertising campaign called Think Different, celebrating rebels, misfits, and visionaries throughout history. It wasn't selling a specific product. It was reasserting what Apple believed itself to be. At a moment when the company badly needed to remember its own story. The turnaround wasn't instantaneous, and skepticism from the press and from Wall Street remained heavy. But the company had stopped its freefall. For the first time in years, there was a single, coherent vision steering Apple again, and the man behind that vision was the same one who had built its very first computer in a garage 20 years earlier. What came next would not just save Apple, it would turn it into something the world had never quite seen before. In 1998, Apple released the first true product of the Jobs-led turnaround, the iMac. It was a striking departure from anything computers had looked like before, a translucent, colorful, egg-shaped all-in-one machine that looked more like a piece of furniture than a piece of technology. It was simple to set up, simple to use, and unmistakably different from every beige box on the market. It was also a massive commercial success, becoming the fastest-selling computer in Apple's history at the time and proving something crucial. Apple could still capture the public's imagination. But the iMac was only the beginning. Jobs began pushing Apple beyond computers entirely. In 2001, the company released the iPod, a compact digital music player built around a simple promise: 1,000 songs in your pocket. Combined with the iTunes software and, later, the iTunes Store, the iPod didn't just sell well. It reshaped how the entire music industry sold and distributed music. The iPod turned Apple, a computer company, into a consumer electronics powerhouse. Sales and brand recognition soared throughout the 2000s. But the biggest transformation was still ahead. In January 2007, Jobs walked on stage and introduced a device he described as 3 products in one: a phone, an iPod, and an internet communicator. It was called the iPhone. Its touchscreen interface, with no physical keyboard, was a radical bet at a time when most phones relied on physical buttons. The bet paid off beyond anything Apple could have predicted. The iPhone didn't just succeed, it redefined what a mobile phone was capable of, and within a few years, it became the foundation of Apple's entire business, generating a scale of revenue no single consumer product had ever achieved before. Apple had gone from a company fighting for survival in the mid-1990s to one of the most influential technology companies on the planet. Built on a string of products that didn't just compete in existing markets, they created entirely new ones. But the story of Apple's ascent was about to take a deeply personal turn. One that would test the company just as it reached the height of its power. In 2004, Steve Jobs was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. For years, he continued leading Apple while undergoing surgeries, treatments, and long periods away from the public eye. During that time, the company continued expanding its ecosystem with products like the App Store and the iPad, transforming entire industries once again. But Jobs' health continued to decline. In August 2011, he resigned as Apple's CEO, handing leadership to Tim Cook, the executive who had spent years quietly building one of the most efficient supply chains in the world. Just weeks later, on October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away at the age of 56. The world mourned not just the loss of a business leader, but of a person who had fundamentally changed how billions of people communicate, work, create, and consume technology. Many wondered whether Apple could survive without the man who had defined its identity for so long. Under Tim Cook's leadership, Apple continued growing at a remarkable pace. The company expanded its services business, introduced new generations of the iPhone, Apple Watch, AirPods, and its own custom-designed processors, while steadily increasing both revenue and profitability. In 2018, Apple became the first publicly traded American company to reach a market value of $1 trillion. It later surpassed $2 trillion, then $3 trillion, becoming the most valuable company in the world. From a garage financed by a sold Volkswagen van and a scientific calculator, Apple had become one of the greatest business success stories ever written. Its story is not simply about technology, it is about vision, obsession, failure, resilience, and the willingness to begin again after losing everything. Because sometimes the companies that change the world don't begin with billions of dollars or perfect plans. Sometimes they begin in a garage,